Thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. Yeah, do I need this one? I don't know. There's so many modes of amplification. I don't want to stand behind the lectern, though, because I don't speak with notes. And I'm not exactly proud of that, but there's a point behind it, which is I increasingly, my inbox every morning has a request for me to speak, or Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, was once asked what had frustrated his political career most, and he drawled, "Events, dear boy, events." And that's what I slightly feel beset by, is events, dear boy, because they come piling into the box. And you must have noticed here in Dublin, just as much as we have in London, that the literary world seems to be defining itself through the medium of events more and more. The event is crucial, just as in music with free downloading, annihilating record sales. There's meant to be a kind of resurgence in live music, but of course it seems to be mostly exploited by the same kinds of big corporates that were making money out of record sales, not the poor musicians. So the kind of literary world is increasingly articulating itself through public events of one sort or another. And, were I to have kind of written a text and brought it here to read aloud to you all, well, what would be the point of that? What would have been the point of me getting up at 5:30 a.m. in Stockwell, South London, and embarking for Dublin? And frankly, what would be the point of you even crawling around the corner to hear it? Because guess what? I could have got Professor Kennedy to sort of request a round robin of email addresses, and I just could have sent it to you. And then you could have read it. Yeah? And there's a lot of, as we move through this kind of epical shift in knowledge technologies from a print-based knowledge technology to a digitally based knowledge technology, I've begun to view all sorts of phenomena very differently. I mean, museums, new museum exhibitions. Well, you can't handle the artifacts. They're usually in very small plastic cases that reflect the light. And the info screed that is attached next to it gets longer and longer, while the kind of digital features of the exhibition are increased. And yet again, I look at these new exhibitions and I think, well, I could just stay at home and read a book on the subject. I don't need to bother to go out. So there has to be something different about an event. We have to kind of, short of my actually wandering among you and caressing you all, smelling your breath, detecting what farinaceous substance is lodged in your molar from this morning's breakfast bowl. Short of that, the best I can do for you is to return. I mean, actually, there was a big vogue in early 19th century Russia for spontaneous composition in poetry and prose in that way. So the least I can do for you is to come and offer you something that is truly an event in the sense that it's unrepeatable. So that's why I don't read from a text. Now on to Professor Kennedy's discourse with me on the subject matter of this lecture. He's rather gazumped me there because I was going to do exactly the same thing and say that he got in touch. He said, would I lecture on literature in the age of Trump? And indeed, I fired him. Well, I thought, unlike most of the dreaded events that come my way, I thought University College Dublin, and we all know who was an alumnus there, and indeed in our next email, Professor Kennedy saw fit to remind me who was an alumnus, just in case I'd forgotten. So it was an event that appealed, an event that actually appealed. You can't say that for many of the events that we see in the world nowadays. I thought I would quite like to come, but he proposed this idea of discussing the impact of Trump on literature, or at any rate, some speculations on what a kind of literary response to the phenomenon that Trump helms with his ghastly orange stuff, whatever it is he's got on his head. And I did indeed snap back that I didn't think there was much to be said on the subject, or rather that it was very difficult to get a direct read-off from a political development to a cultural one. And indeed, you know, it's perhaps a slightly facile point, but you can think of many, many cultural situations that were incredibly vibrant and productive and innovative under very, very bad political circumstances. I'm not necessarily talking about totalitarian circumstances, though even that arguably has been productive of some very, very fine art. But, you know, thinking about kind of essentially decadent cultures, you think of immediately of fin de siècle Vienna. You hardly a kind of beacon of liberalism and hope in the world. So I rather resisted the idea that we could necessarily read off some development in literature from the fact of the political changes of 2016, to which Professor Kennedy objected. Or he didn't really object, but he made 2 points. One point he made was to recall Philip Roth's comments on observing President Nixon on TV in 1969. And I can't quote it verbatim, but I think the essence of, or the substance of what Roth said was that looking at Nixon on television, he felt that the current social milieu was throwing up more interesting characters than novelists could hope to create, and at a far greater rate. Well, I think that's very interesting that Professor Kennedy seized upon that, because this is not a literary response to a political reality. It's a comment by a writer on something he's watching on television, which is not quite the same thing. Okay, fair play. Professor Kennedy then enlarged on that and said, well, you can see the impact of Nixonian politics. I mean, and if you think some of us here are just about old enough to actually remember Nixon as a political phenomenon. And in some ways, I mean, of course, nowadays he looks like a massive statesman in comparison to the pygmies who currently bestride the international stage. But back then, strange to relate, he definitely was the Donald Trump of his era. He evoked exactly, or very similar, kind of cringy feelings as the current iteration. But Professor Kennedy went on to say, well, okay, you can see Roth's response to Nixonian America and to, you know, what that great, God, his name's eluded me. This is the time that you wish you had written a lecture, Will. It'll come to me later. Fantastic book called A Bright Shining Lie that was written about Vietnam. You might remember the writer. But I just like, you know, the Nixonian era could be characterized as a bright shining lie. That's exactly what it was. So, you know, and Liam Kennedy was saying, well, okay, you can move on and you can see the development of this reaction to the bright shining lie in Roth's fiction, or really the developing, I suppose, with the big American trilogy, American Pastoral of the late 80s and into the 90s, I Married a Communist, and so forth. Well, I don't really dig Philip Roth much. I mean, he's a great writer. You know, I'm going to say that very annoying writerly thing, at the sentence level. Whatever, what does that mean? It's like, he's a great writer at the punctuation level. Or he's a great lover, subscript. He's good at underlining. He's a great writer at the sentence level, great prose writer, and the novels have a beautiful and stately structure. You know, they feel like the 19th century novels that never were written, but probably should have been by a time traveler going back from the 20th century. But ideologically, politically, in terms of his sense of outrage, acceptance, annoyance, to the political and living and felt reality of human life, the articulation of a consistent moral standpoint lying behind the text. I don't find any of that in Roth. What I actually find is a certain kind of, frankly, vapid liberal humanism, an assumption that, an almost Panglossian assumption about a set of values that, unfortunately, have been called into question not by Donald Trump, not by Michael Gove, or those other people, the one with the hair, Johnson, not by them, but by events, dear audience, events themselves, and by the internal contradictions of an ideology that has not proved fit for purpose as we've moved into the 21st century. And I'll park that idea and return to it. So, then came the little exchange in which I said, unlike Stendhal, I did not necessarily believe that art was the mirror of life. But Professor Kennedy wouldn't let it lie. And I think we were enjoying this email exchange to some extent, and came back and said, no, I feel that there is something to be said on this, on a literary response, and indeed that experimental writers often respond to new political realities. Actually, they often respond, he didn't use the phrase, not being as pretentious as me, but they often respond to them avant la lettre. And then he cited a text by my late friend and literary mentor, Jim Ballard, called Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan. Those words probably haven't been spoken in this room before. Or perhaps they have. One likes to imagine one honourable Irish academician creeping up to another, perhaps still more honourable Irish academician, by the photocopying machine perhaps, and just gently whispering, why I want to fuck Ronald Reagan, and perhaps showing them a photograph of the notable screen actor. Well, I appreciated this little carrot being dangled before me by Professor Kennedy, but I have to observe within the context of thinking about literature in the age of Trump that not only was, Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan written some years before Ronald Reagan's own political career, it was published, it's a subsection of Ballard's Magister opus, the Atrocity Exhibition, and it was published in 1969. So, okay, so we're now citing a text that was written about political events that hadn't yet occurred, that is now 60 years old, with reference to the relevance of literature, specifically literature, mind, to politics, either in the sense of responding to a new political reality or, gulp, influencing a political reality. Just imagine that, literature actually influencing things, literature being a kind of cynosure around which people's thinking gathers. We've had this incredible upset over the last year, a couple of years, and we're looking for something to orient ourselves around. We're children, really, of ideology in one way or another. We need a structure of ideas, something that speaks to our moral sense, something that explains the reality that we're confronting, and something that provides us with viable heuristics we can use to interpret the events around us. Wouldn't it be amazing if people looked to literature for that? But they sure as shit aren't. I can tell you that right now. And nor will they be, is more to the point. So when I kind of, in essence, this entire talk is my cavilling with Professor Kennedy. If you come looking for a positive thesis, go somewhere else. I mean, go to Starbucks, frankly, where, Starbucks, which is a loathsome multinational coffee chain you may be aware of. There's one across the road. Yeah, absolutely. Indeed, I think my favorite headline in the American satirical magazine, The Onion, is new Starbucks opens in restroom of existing Starbucks. But in the wake of Trump's ban on visitors to the States from 7 countries which just happen to have vastly large Muslim majorities, the guy who runs Starbucks at least offered, I can't remember the figure, it was either 1,000 or 10,000 migrants internationally jobs in the chain. Well, you may say that's a curse as much as a blessing, but it was something. So you might look to Starbucks for your response to the age of Trump. So I started thinking to myself, well, if literature, for reasons that I may well return to again, if literature is not where people are going to be looking for their ideological fix, their moral fix, their political fix in response to these events, when did they do such a thing? Or what sort of examples can we think of literary people being influential, in fact? And I thought, it's kind of no exercise, no accident really, and perfectly understandable that Professor Kennedy heads up the Clinton Institute at UCD and is, of course, preoccupied by American literature and American letters. He also mentioned post-truth politics and this concept of the filter bubble, the idea that under conditions of bidirectional digital media, people are starting to get their political news via feeds on Twitter or via Facebook. So it's unmediated by what we think of as the traditional gatekeepers of culture. But in a way, I think that Professor Kennedy lives in a filter bubble. And he lives in a filter bubble called being an academic critic, and being an academic critic who specializes in American literature. I mean, I have to say, I far prefer his filter bubble to the filter bubbles that people are getting through their phones. But nonetheless, it is a kind of filter bubble because it's given Professor Kennedy, quite unavoidably, a rather exaggerated view of the importance of literature, particularly because he's probably studying what we think of as contemporary literature, recent contemporary literature, when, particularly in the USA, following on from the observation about Roth and Nixon, and maybe Ballard as a kind of distal interventionist on the American scene, though I think he only went to the States once or perhaps twice in his life. Why I want to fight Ronald Reagan. Look, I've said it 3 times. Maybe if you say it 3 times in the Royal Irish Academy, Ronald Reagan will rise from the dead, ready for action. Who knows? I've got a PhD student at Brunel who's doing his thesis on Norman Mailer, and so I've been, is the right word forced? Yes, I think probably is. I've been forced to read some Mailer over the last year or 2, or more significantly, engage, particularly, Mailer, the most Iliistic of writers, always constantly referring to himself in the third person as if he was an achieved fact. But actually, that Iliism was a function of an era, I think. And when you look at, Michael Lennon's collection of Mailer's correspondence, or when you look at a lot of Mailer's long-form journalism from around the time of the notorious Democratic Convention in Chicago, Armies of the Night, all of that sort of incredible period of political ferment in the late 60s and early 70s in the USA. You look at his correspondence with Diana Trilling, or the way he talks about the literary milieu of the period. Okay, you might say, well, this was a guy who did think he might have a political career of some. He ran for mayor of New York. But I don't think he's unrepresentative of a self-confidence in the literary world and a belief and an understanding that the literary world was exactly that kind of cynosure, drawing in people who wanted to hear good perspectives on the events that were taking place around them. There is this astonishing sense, not only when you read Mailer, not only that he deserves to be read, that what he says is of significance, and that this is a given fact, but that his position is in some sense secure. The idea of the connection with contemporary influence and what we think of as posterity, as the afterlife of the culture or the continuation of the culture, was absolutely achieved at that point. And I would argue that key to a sense of it was the literary novel. Even the literary novel was that important. I think people's perception when I was growing up, and this very much relates to political and philosophic thinking as well, was that the literary novel was like the culture's DNA. It was kind of, you know, the phenotypes might express themselves differently in every generation, but the genotypical culture would be transmitted on and on and on just by the fact that everybody read whatever they read. They read the canonical works as they were growing up. And even if they didn't read them, I'm not suffering from a terrible delusion that in the past, you know, poor old Jimmy J thought that every Dublin cab driver or bus driver should be able to read Ulysses. I mean, I don't know what he was on, frankly, apart from alcohol. But you know, I think what he did believe is that not so much that every bus driver in Dublin would read Ulysses, but that they might have the aspiration to read Ulysses. They would feel that Ulysses existed at a point, possibly somewhere near the Empyrean, of their culture. Yeah, and that was a given. But I think more widely, you know, that sense that, you know, people would buy, you know, join the history club and get sent a leather-tooled volume every month and assemble them on their shelves, or people would say things like, well, I'm going to read the classics when I retire. There was a sense very much of literature as this thing that we're going to... Now, here we are in the Royal Irish Academy, and my companion, Nellie Caprillion, and I this afternoon went to visit the Dead Zoo. Because she'd seen it in Peaky Blinders. And Penny Dreadful, yeah. And I'm sure you've all been. And it bears some similarity to this room we're in. And these are dead, too. These are stuffed, these books. They're stuffed. They're taxidermy books. And you know, the last few years, again, I had to return to this now almost legendary exchange of emails. I said in our email exchange that, you know, I have been lecturing and talking, and Professor Kennedy animadverted to this as well in his introduction, on this epical transformation in knowledge technologies over the last 4 or 5 years. And frankly, I don't know why everybody else isn't talking about it. They don't, you know, because I'll just restate my arguments very, very simply. It only take 5 minutes, and I know that quite a few of you simply won't be able to take it on board, and that's because you have what Marshall McLuhan termed Gutenberg minds. Your minds are formed by the book. Not so much you guys. I mean, you're doubtless you're very bookish, but you're quite young. But anybody, I would say, 40 and up, certainly 45 and up, you're formed by the book so comprehensively, so internalized is your understanding that the book represents your repository of knowledge, the internalization of the content of the book, and your own mind is like the codex. It is bound. It is in your skull. It is contained. You walk around with a body of canonical knowledge that you've assembled lovingly. You have quotations. You have anecdotes. You have all of that stuff. For you to think of a life without the book is like being decapitated, in fact. It might be like losing your head in some way. But I venture to suggest that for younger people, it simply isn't like that anymore. And what Marshall McLuhan says, of course, is that when a new technology of communications arises, it cannot help but significantly alter any pre-existing method of communication or media, and usually doing away with it altogether. And my feeling is that as people read more and more digitally, and wait a minute, I'm not talking about reading books digitally, because you might be sitting there thinking, it's not much fun reading on Kindle. I like to read on a real book and all of that sort of stuff. Fine. I call that the vinyl solution, because everybody's been saying the last couple of years, whenever I say these things, they say, oh, well, you're always going on about this, but vinyl sales are up. Right, so you see lots of people, don't you, wandering around St. Stephen's Green with a tiny little record player on their hand with a sort of little horn like this, listening to Charlie Arpin sing the Volga Boat song. No, you don't, in fact. Yeah, vinyl sales are up because we're a relentlessly consumerist society in which everybody's always trying to find something that kind of distinguishes them, something more to buy. Or they say things to me like, oh, but ebook sales have stabilized. And actually, paper book sales are up, Will, the last year or two. Well, I did a little digging and delving into those book sales because I'm quite interested in it. And I'm published in London by Penguin Random House, which is a publisher that is now so big, it's, probably got several branches of Starbucks in it. And actually, their profits were made the last 2 years almost exclusively by spin-off books by vloggers. You didn't see that one coming. You thought I was going to say, Mary Berry's Book of Bums or something, but no. No, it's vloggers' spin-off books from... Sorry, we're all thinking about that now, aren't we? If you take anything away with you this evening, let it be that. So with vloggers' spin-off books, I think the point is not that people are reading novels on digital platforms, they're reading other stuff. They're reading tweets, they're looking at images. And if you look at the history of literature and media, and you look back to even the transition from the hand press to the mechanized press, from the mechanized press to litho presses, to web offset presses, which bring you the newspaper revolution of the late 19th century, and in a way bring you universal literacy as well. It's difficult to think of a culture in which you would have a universal literacy without a technology that could supply you with enough print for everybody to read at a cheap enough price. And you look at any of these alterations and you see that the artistic forms that are sustained within any given medium change radically. The novel is a function of the codex. It exists in relation to the codex. I know it doesn't seem that way to you guys. I know you think you have a kind of novel in your head that isn't in the covers of a book or it exists in some other form. And I know that we all absorb long-form narratives in different ways, and we might think there are kinds of equivalence between them, but there really aren't. I mean, they're different. They're quite radically different. And people are reading a lot more, and they're writing a lot more. But there's a subset of people who are, of course, writing novels a lot more. They're called creative writing students, and they're shit at it. I mean, really dreadful. It's like, there are various kind of phrases or taglines that seem like kind of quite fun at the time. But when they really come to pass, it's pretty dreadful. One of them was Warhol's line in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Well, that's come to pass, and isn't it horrible? It's kind of, and I might park that thought and return to it as well. I'm parking a lot of thoughts. I've got a kind of car park of them out back. I may never go back to them, though. I may just press on. And the other one is, everybody's got a novel in them. They haven't. They really haven't. That doesn't mean that they're not. Why would anybody say everybody's got a novel in them? Well, they said it because we had this idea that the novel represented the DNA of our culture. That's why they said it, because to say, oh, no, you haven't got a novel in you, would be like saying you're not a cultured person or you're not capable. So it was this idea of the aspiration. Oh, I've got a novel in me, I might write it one day. you didn't necessarily have to write it. It was the sense of feeling that you had the novel in you that was important. And I regard creative writing as the kind of terminal moraine at the end of the great glaciation of literature. That's what it is. It's the care home for the dying novel, where it lies on the sun porch, getting stupider and stupider and more illiterate until it finally expires. And it's not just the quality of the writing of creative writing students that's abysmal, it's their aspiration, or rather their lack of aspiration, and their lack of understanding even anymore what the standards are. That's how far the canonical has already begun to crumble away, is that you find students quite often, even students gulp at PhD level, because yes, people, there is such a thing as a doctorate of creative writing. And I said this in a Guardian piece I wrote a while ago, and I got into considerable trouble for it, but I'm going to say it again, because that's the kind of guy I am. But, you know, I supervise a couple of creative writing students at Brunel to be collegiate, really, and also out of curiosity sometimes. And one of them, you know, the degree consists in you've got to write a novel, that you've got to get the novel that's in you out. I wouldn't necessarily call it writing. I think some of them probably go to surgeons to get it done. Well, you've got to do that, and then you've got to write a kind of dissertation about your own creative process, right? I haven't written anything on my creative process, and I'm 55 years old, and I've published 23 books. The idea that some twerp, wet behind the ears, is going to sit down and write a 35,000-word discursive essay about their creative process when they've never published a novel, a culture in which that could even happen is bizarre, isn't it? It's utterly bizarre. It's a complete deformation of the idea. I'm sure Professor Kennedy would agree with this, that it's a complete deformation of academic standards, let alone literary ones. It's an unholy miscegenation, a deathly stridulation of the corpses of scholarship and literature copulating at the end of time. Well, it is. Oh, I love reading. I love novels. I love to read novels. I love reading. Why are you studying creative writing? I love novels. I love reading. Love writing. So, the codex, these dead codexes, is what sustains novel. And we can see if we look, you know, going back to the swagger and confidence of Mailer and William Styron and Gore Vidal and those kinds of characters, I began to realize halfway through my career, or as, you know, for me the breakpoint year is 2004. It's the inception of wireless broadband. It's when one's interface with the web becomes frictionless. It's when, if you're typing on it, it's when I stopped typing on a computer that was internet connected, because it's not writing in the original sense. What you find if you write that way, well, I mean, when I talk to the students who are writing that way, it's a disaster. They're editing on the screen. They've got no sense. I say to them, you must print it out and hand correct, because unless you have a sense of the physical type, you need an analog of the novel, and almost a spatial analog. I mean, the paper is kind of thin, but it still exists as an object in space and time, in order to make your thinking coherent. You just won't achieve it. Well, that gives you, you're nodding, aren't you? Quite vigorously, because you've found this to be the case, haven't you? But to think about it, follow the logic. What it suggests to you is the very art form you're engaged on is intended to take that form. That's why the means of its production are papery, and the end result is also a papery thing too. That's how it evolved. If you think about writing on a networked computer, you know, which I, you know, for my sins do when I'm writing journalism or something like that, and you're typing along, you go, oh, she drove a Morris Traveller, and you think, you remember those Morris Travellers? They're like the most hutty looking of 1960s cars. They even have that kind of wood half timbering. They're the kind of Tudor Beetham car. Yeah. He said, she drove a Morris Traveller. You think, oh, what did a Morris Traveller look like? Morris Traveller. Not just one. There are 1,900,000 images of Morris Travellers for you to look at. That's why the novel never got written. It's easy to Morris Traveller on another man's wound, as Eamon O'Malley might have said. I knew I had to get that in somewhere. In fact, the whole lecture was leading up to that very bad pun on one of the great books, I think, of the Irish Revolutionary period. Returning to this problem, she drove a Morris Traveller, there's the Morris Traveller, then you start describing the Morris Traveller you see on the screen. You are not thinking in words, you are not creating in words. Your words are the reportage of the images you're seeing on the web. And that's just, you can think of the proliferation of that problem in descriptive writing and its impact on the way that a literary novelist, and bear in mind, we're talking about what's the aspiration with what we think of as literary fiction. It's a complete gestalt of style and content. You know, it's not about, everything must be completely synergizing, the way that something's written. It must be written in words. It must be written by somebody who is thinking in a literary way, who's thinking in literature, not somebody who is transcribing what they see on the screen. So, you know, I myself went back to writing on a manual typewriter in 2004 and went that way intuitively. It wasn't thought out. I just recoiled from the computer. I couldn't quite figure out what it was, but I knew there was something wrong with it. So, yeah, I don't think the novel's going to die. It's too good an art form to die. There's no question about that. But, you know, in the future, already now, people have to kind of train themselves to stay in the text, to not slide out of the text. If you think of a text, again, a long-form literary fiction being presented in the digital form, what's to stop you going through the text and looking at the picture of the Morris Traveller? Oh, she drove a Morris Traveller. Oh, I don't know what a Morris Traveller is. Oh, I know, I'll press my button on the Gorilla Glass and the marvelous technology of capacitive touch will take me directly, with no friction, no interference, to a Morris Traveller. And then people who looked at this Morris Traveller also enjoyed looking at this. Or, 2 hours later, I get back to the text, okay? I'm not in the text. If I bothered to turn the page or swipe the page, the context that would have explained what a Morris Traveller was on the next page anyway. Yeah? Because the novel is designed to be internally self-explanatory, okay? It's designed as a piece of knowledge technology to contextualize itself, all right? That's how the form. So, are we going to get novels that are adapted for the web and for digital reading? No, we're not. It was tried from the get-go with hypertext writing very, very early on. It just doesn't work. There's all sorts of problems with it. It's not the same thing. I mean, I could go on at length, and have, and will, about why the literary novel subsists in this particular papery environment. But you get the point, and if you don't get it, well, when you wake up in the middle of the night because you remember what I said in the august surroundings of the Royal Irish Academy, you'll find me crouching by your bed, looking at you malevolently, because you forgot. Consider the last 50 or 60 years and look at the points at which literature, or the context in which literature has had an influence in some sense, or the response of literature has been important to events, or how. Well, I was a bit hard about Philip Roth's novels and about his tetralogy of novels, but I acknowledge that the writers of the new journalism period did have some impact and were read and were significant. But I think for a really kind of spectacular and decidedly kind of literary influence in America, you'd have to probably go back to something like the publication of John Hersey's book-length Hiroshima in 1946. That was an occasion when they ran the presses 24/7. People queued up round the block. People passed it round. It was a water cooler moment provoked by a literary work. Okay, and I think that's pretty unusual in the States, or pretty unusual generally. I mean, look at contemporary Ireland. When can we think of a book that absolutely galvanized Ireland and that was read by everybody and commented on by everybody? Frank McCourt? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. So McCourt is writing about an experience that was extremely important to Irish people of his generation, and indeed, arguably, as to successive generations of Irish people. And of course, it's in a sense the relationship with America and emigration and so forth. Not a great book, though. It's got to be said. You're looking at me coldly. It's not a great book. It's a populist work, fine, but it was articulating a sentiment rather than a political standpoint or a set of philosophic ideas. It was a sentimental moment. Can we acknowledge that? Thank you, sir. I don't mean to diss. I've been waiting for that one for a while as well. Or just on a Dublin level, Roddy Doyle's books in the early 90s, I think I remember being in Dublin at the time and people talking about them, and there was a generalized sense of engagement with that. And also because I think Dubliners in particular hadn't felt that they'd been portrayed in quite that way before. But can we see this as an important and influential literary intervention in a political realm? I don't think we really can we? I mean, I was casting my mind around thinking about kind of what kinds of countries do you get, is literature still important in, or does it produce those kind of water cooler moments? And the only example I could really think of was Michel Houellebecq's Submission in France, which has been absolutely huge in that way. It sparked a national debate and so forth. France is a kind of special case, though. France is managing quite well through a strong collective effort of self-hypnosis, because that's what you need to do to live in any filter bubble. You need to persuade yourself that there's nothing outside the filter bubble, to remain in its own literary filter bubble. But bear in mind, France is the only country in the world, which I'm aware of, that has a government department that is responsible for policing and delimiting its own language in that way. You know, whereas here in Ireland, you have a government department that's responsible for teaching you all a language that you never speak. So how's that going to help you with preserving literature? Especially given, you know, most of your contemporary literature is not written in that language. It's not going to be very helpful, is it? You're looking at me stonily now, but it's true. Let alone the awful condition of English letters, which is so strongly porous to American English and to American cultural influences that it's not even worth it. I mean, the thing about Ireland, of course, is that you punch that expression beloved of English politicians that makes you want to kick them repeatedly in the balls until they give up the ghost. Why do they want to? Why do these bastards want to punch above their weight on the international stage? Haven't they seen the damage it does? They should be punching, yeah, they should be punching above their weight and they should be annihilated. All right, I'm getting carried away now. So, yeah, because you genuinely do punch above your weight in the international literary world, maybe that will preserve your sense of your literary culture rather longer than other nations. But, yeah, I think it probably will. So you'll probably hold out a bit longer. But over the other side of the Irish Sea, I would argue we're already screwed. And if I think about the books that have been really significant and really had a impact and again, the water cooler moment, there's only been one, well, I think there have been 2 books that have had that impact since I went to university in 1979. So that's a long time. And one of them, of course, is Rushdie's Satanic Verses. Anybody read it? So that was really influential book, wasn't it? Yeah? It was really important. And actually, just to be mean, because I am mean, you know, when I hear people in London, people who are mixed up in the Rushdie affair in publishing, or writers who use a salad bar, this sense of puffed up pride and importance that comes off. I don't know whether you've ever heard a conversation like that, but let's just think about this for a moment. This was a book that was written that offended a lot of politicized and angry radical Muslims, an emergent trend at the time, resulted in the deaths of a lot of people, and frankly was written, whatever he says now, was written largely out of ignorance. Its author was ignorant of the possible impact because he didn't really understand what he was doing, actually, and quite how offensive, potentially, and blasphemous what he was doing was. The text then gets picked up by liberal humanists as an example of what, exactly? Of what their ideology must be allowed to have, which is books that are that offensive to people, okay? So it's a bit like the argument with Charlie Hebdo and with the je m'en foutism that you see in French satire. The argument is that our culture, our great, enlightened liberal humanist culture, is defined in some sense by this. It doesn't mean you actually read the book. It's not about the literary quality of the book. Nobody actually, well, I've yet to hear anybody make a serious case for the Satanic Verses being an important book as a novel in that sense. I've read it, you've read it, it's not that great, is it? Full of lingerie, rather boring.
I liked it a lot.
Did you? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we'll nude mud wrestle later to decide that one. I don't think it's a particularly great book. I certainly don't think it's gone on to be a real kind of talking point or strongly influential. I've never in my life heard somebody refer to it or what's in the text as being. So, you know, look at this idea. The literary culture, certainly the English literary culture, has been on this kind of life support of scandal and having kind of caused, and it's defined negatively by what it is not by what it is, okay? That's the moment for literature in that way. So I think that's a very good example. I think there's one other book that has been hugely influential by an English writer, hugely influential, incredible water cooler book, something people really talked about, something people were happy to be seen reading. And I think it is the book that has been most influential politically in England and in the wider world. You might argue that it is England's kind of political, Britain, I'm not very comfortable with Britain, as you probably realised, but Britain's, well, who's comfortable with Britain anymore? It barely exists. What larks? Has given to the world, and it's a book that both anticipates and reinforces evolving social and cultural trends. It's a book many people look to as a kind of beacon and a touchstone of moral and ethical probity in the wider world. And of course I refer to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. No, really. Because like everybody read that, didn't they? They really did. You didn't. Not one word? Well, bully for you. I venture to suggest you either weren't a child during the period involved, aren't very childish, since so many adults happily read it, and indeed, as you will recall, later sequels of the series were published with 2 different covers so that adults wouldn't feel quite so pathetic wandering around reading a book that was pitched at somebody with a reading age of 11 in the street. So you obviously didn't belong to either of those categories, and I would also wager, though I may be completely wrong and you just may be a very enlightened parent, that you didn't have young children at the time the sequence was published, because those of us who had numerous children during the Harry Potter years found ourselves reading J.K. Rowling's execrable prose aloud for hour upon hour, like the priests of some demented religion. And you will recall the acres of bullshit that was expended explaining that reading this drivel was going to spark a huge renaissance in literary engagement. Do you remember that? And through that literary engagement, following my earlier statement, a reconnection with literary fiction and the novel as the DNA of our culture. Way to go. Didn't happen. Didn't happen at all. Why? I mean, I have to say, I have nothing against Jo Rowling at all, and my way of judging somebody's character who I don't know is to wait for them to turn up on Desert Island Discs. And I heard Jo Rowling on Desert Island Discs, and her first record was the Jam's Eton Rifles. And anybody who chooses something that is that anti-establishment is on my ticket. And she seemed like a thoroughly nice woman, and everything I hear about her is that, well, what a paradox that this thoroughly nice, decent woman should have produced this great pile of codswallop that has fixated people and been part of their perversion of our literary sensibilities. But I would argue in political, social, and even philosophic terms, this was just. Jo Rowling ushered in the kidult era we're now living in. You know, partly because for demographic reasons and partly for kind of cultural reasons. You know, it was the hippies, after all, who first made J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings such a big book. It wasn't when it was published. It was a kidult phenomenon as well. So you can look at the whole period from the social revolutions and cultural revolutions of late 1960s through to our current imballistic filter bubble as being bookended by these 2 great works of kidult fiction. Because ours is the era of the kidult, and ours is the era when those of us who still hang on for all our might to the frail bark of liberal humanism as it's tossed on increasingly mountainous waves, much as the swift ferry Ulysses was tossed on the backs of the waves in the Irish Sea this morning as I was coming over from Holyhead, then you can see that the self-enclosed world of Hogwarts is very much like our delusory world of liberal humanism, in which Pangloss like all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, including the continuation of our much vaunted literary tradition, which we all love, and yet none of us are really that engaged in, except for Professor Kennedy. Bless him. I'll happily take some questions if you have any.